Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. We've been studying about the women's court in the Holy Temple, in Hilchot Beit HaBechira, in Maimonides' classic work, Laws of the Chosen House, Chapter 5. And we have been studying of late the four chambers that are located in the four corners of the women's court. We studied about the chamber of the Nazarites, chamber of the wood, where the wood was checked and stored. Wood was checked for the altar to make sure that it contained no worms. The chamber of the oil and wine, chamber of the Mitzoraim, those that were afflicted with tsarat, sometimes translated as leprosy. Just add several thoughts about those chambers. We learned some unusual sounding things. We learned about the obligation of the person who is concluding the Nazarite vow to shave the hair and to burn it in the fire that is underneath the cauldron, as it were, that is cooking the meat of the peace offering. That actually you can read about in the Torah itself. It's something that we read about in Numbers 6:18. The Nazarite shall shave off the crown of hair on his head before the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, of course, to become the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem. Shall take the hair, and the verse continues and tells us, place it in the fire under the peace offering. The truth is, Maimonides points out, we have a footnote that actually bidiavad, which means second best, and as if it's not possible for him to shave off his hair in this chamber, he is allowed from the Torah to do that anywhere in the land of Israel, but the actual burning of the hair must be done underneath that cauldron in that chamber. And we have another comment in the Talmud, in the tractate that deals with the laws of the Nazarites. Masechet Nazir explains that kind of in a feeling of deference to the Shekhinah, to the divine presence that is located in the Holy Temple, the shaving is not carried out in the sanctuary proper, but rather in this chamber. But the door to the sanctuary is open from this chamber, so there is that connection. Also wanted to make one more clarification before we continue. We mentioned regarding the chamber of oil, Lishkat Beit Shamanya, although wine is kept there as well. One commentary, the Ezrat Kohanim, classic work on Masechet Midot, mentions the fact that it was called Beit Shamanya after the name of the shemen, the oil, because there was more oil there than wine. But there is also another commentary called the Yeriat Shlomo, who points out the fact that, and this is why he wants to explain that the name of the chamber mentions the oil rather than the wine, because a korban, an offering, is acceptable if the wine libation is lacking. However, all of the meal offerings are invalidated if they lack oil. So we see that the oil is a very important ingredient, according to the Torah, for the offerings, even more so than wine. So we're continuing today with Halacha Tet, the ninth Halacha, the ninth entry of Chapter 5, Hilchot Beit HaBechira of the Rambam, and we are still on the subject of the Ezrat Nashim, and I mentioned previously that now we're going to be learning about one of the major reasons for the expression Ezrat Nashim, which of course is somewhat misleading because the women's court was not only for women. This was actually the furthest point that most Israelites would be entering, except on certain special occasions. Most pure Israelites would be coming until this point as well, males as well. So we read here in Halakha Tet, Ezrat Hanashim Haita Mukefet Gizuz Tara. The women's court was surrounded by a balcony. Kidei Shiyu Hanashim Ro'ot Milmalan V'Hanashim Milamatan, so that the women would be able to gaze, to look, to see from above, and the men from below. Kidei Shelo Yiyu Me'ur Bavin, so that they would not be mixed together, the men and the women. What is this all about? The concept of the balcony that was built, especially in the women's court, is described in a section of Tractate Sukkah. Why Tractate Sukkah? Because in Tractate Sukkah there is a discussion in the Mishnah and in the Talmud regarding that important occasion that we have studied about together numerous times, Simchat Beit HaShoeva, festival, the joy of the water libation. During Sukkot, every day during the intermediary days, there is a special ceremony which is part of the tradition handed down from Moses at Mount Sinai called the water libation. While oil was poured on the altar every day, as we just mentioned, that's why so much oil was kept in the Lishkat Beit Shamanya, the oil for the libations that accompanied the daily offerings, water was poured on the altar in a special cup that was fixed in the one corner of the altar. Water was poured on the altar only during Sukkot. That's the Nusuch HaMayim, the water libation, as opposed to the Nusuch HaYayin, the wine libation. And the water that was poured out on the altar during Sukkot was part of a very important process that is associated with the resting of the spirit of prophecy upon all of the people of Israel, and also was a time of tremendous joy, tremendous feeling of closeness and proximity to the divine presence. And in fact, the Festival of the Water Libation is described as the happiest occasion, not only of the year, but of life. So much so that the expression mentioned in the Mishnah is, whoever has never seen the Festival of the Water Libation carried out, whoever has never witnessed what went on in the Holy Temple during the Festival of the Water Libation has never experienced true joy in their entire life. And there's a very beautiful description there in the Mishnah about how the great sages of Israel would honor the presence of God through tremendous joy at the Festival of the Water Libation. And those who actually were active in the celebration of the festival were the great sages of Israel. They're the ones who would actually be dancing before the presence of God, whereas the common folk, as it were, they would be more just as spectators. It was really the sages themselves, accompanied by the Levitical choir standing on the 15 steps that rose up to the Nicanor gates and playing their music and singing. The sages of Israel would engage in tremendous, joyful celebration. And of course, when the sages of Israel were celebrating, it was combined joy combined with a great feeling of awe and reverence, and that was something that was very palpable and very much communicated to the people. And the people were watching. And there is a principle in the Torah that whenever there is a mixture of men and women, there can be a certain kind of frivolity that can develop, a sort of possibility of impropriety. And the sages were most concerned with, of course, especially in the view of the sanctity of the festival, but at any time, with preventing a situation that could cause feelings that are not proper at the time of being in Hashem's presence. So therefore, this whole concept of the gezuztara, the balcony that was especially made in this area known as the women's court to accommodate the righteous women of Israel to be able to be part of the spectators of the Festival of the Water Libation, but to be not in the same place exactly as the men. In the Mishnah of Tractate Sukkah, this is referred to as a great rectification. It was a great tikkun that was made because of the fact that it facilitated the prevention, made sure that there would not be any sort of improper frivolity, levity at this great occasion, because there is a principle that when you have joy, which may be in fact very pure, but when you have a feeling of elation, there can enter into that something which is improper as well. So this is what we find in Tractate Sukkah, and the description there is actually as follows. Of how the women would gaze from above. So in the Gemara, in the discussion of our sages in the Talmud on the development of this whole idea and how it evolved, Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis, learned as follows, that originally the women were inside and the men were on the outside. And it still became a situation where they entered into their certain kind of lightheadedness, it's called. Kalot Rosh. Then they rectified that, the sages, and said, okay, the women will be sitting outside and the men will be inside. But that still didn't help. There was still a certain frivolity. And then they made this gezustera, the balcony where the women would be above and the men below. So this is the structure of the women's court, and essentially, according to many authorities, it's from this great rectification, as it were, the accommodation of the whole entire house of Israel to be present at the great, wonderful spiritual experience of the Festival of Water Libation, and to ensure and safeguard that it stays spiritual and pure. That's why this area became known as the Ezrat Nashim, the women's court, although it is not exclusively only for women. Now, we continue in Halacha Tet. Ubayit gadol haya bitzad ha'azara bitzfona mibachutz. There was a large chamber in the side of the Azara, the side of the court, on the northern side from the outside, that is to say, Bein ha'azara v'hachel, located, situated between the Azara and the Chel, which we've learned exactly what that section is. V'haya banui kippah, and it was mounted by a dome. It had unlike the chambers that we learnt about, the 4 chambers, this structure, located on the side of the Azara, was covered over by a domed roof. This is the expression of Maimonides, v'haya banui kippah, built with a kippah, like a kippah, a dome, umukaf rovadim shel even, and it was surrounded inside. It featured on all sides shelves of stone, protrusions, rovadim, of stone. We'll see soon what these stone protrusions in the wall of this large chamber, Bayit Gadol he calls it, see what these protrusions facilitated. V'hu haya nikra Beit Hamoked. And this chamber was called the chamber of the hearth, chamber of the fire. Ushnei ptachim hayulo, and there were 2 entrances to this chamber. Echad patuch la'azara. One of these entrances was open to the courtyard itself, to the court, the Azara, ve'echad patuach l'chel, and one opened onto the Chel. So, what is this chamber all about? After, of course, Maimonides teaches us about the structure of the women's court, he's teaching us about the Beit HaMoked, which also we learn about in Masechet Midot, and this was a very large chamber. There are some other chambers which are found in the court of Israel that Maimonides is going to teach us about much later in Halacha number 17. But he has made a distinction, and he's telling us about this chamber now, probably because it is, in fact, the large chamber contains other chambers, also possibly because it does not open onto the court of Israel, so it's different in that regard. So, the placement of this chamber, the chamber of the hearth, the chamber of the fire, if you'd like to call it, is in the north side. This is also explained by Mishnah, chapter 1, Mishnah Hay. And the aspect of the dome also, the domed roof, is also something which is mentioned in the Mishnah. The Bar Tanura, an important commentary on the Mishnah, goes out of his way to tell us, explains that it did not have a second story, as some of the structures in the temple. It did have a rounded roof, but that roof did not contain a second story. And the first thing, in addition to this concept that this chamber had a domed roof, the first thing that the Rambam tells us, which he finds outstanding and which is noteworthy, is the fact that it contained these shelves along the walls, and they basically protruded from the wall itself, kind of like steps. They were ascending in size, and according to the tradition recounted by the important commentary, the Tiferet Yisrael, on the Mishnayot of Tractate Midot, the elders of the Kohanim, those that were advanced in age, would sleep at night on these protrusions, on the upper protrusions. This chamber is basically like a dormitory facility where the Kohanim of the particular Beit Av, in other words, the family clan, which is traced according to the father, who is serving in the temple at in a particular week, who need to arise early in the morning to begin the sacred service in the Holy Temple, they sleep at night in this chamber, the Beit HaMoked. And the elder of the Kohanim sleep on these sort of like beds or cots made of stone that are elevated above the floor of the chamber. And this is to differentiate from the younger of the Kohanim who actually slept on the floor in the Beit HaMoked. Now, on his commentary on the Mishnah in Tractate Midot, the Rambam explains further about this chamber, the Beit HaMoked, the chamber of the Hearth, and there he tells us, again, the Beit HaMoked was a large chamber, and that it included 4 chambers. And the Beit HaMoked in itself, a chamber, featured 4 smaller chambers within it, and in one of them, this is the language of the Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnah, in one of them there was a fire burning constantly, and thus the entire chamber received the name Beit HaMoked. It was actually on account of the fire in one of these particular chambers. And in his commentary on Masechet Midot, the Rambam Maimonides identifies this particular chamber where the fire was burning as the place where the Kohanim would warm themselves around this fire after their immersion in the mikveh. We're going to be learning more about this particular mikveh in question here in the Beit HaMoked area. We're going to be learning more about that. And that chamber, the chamber with the fire, is called Lishkat Beit HaMoked. So in other words, the entire larger structure, the Bayit Gadol, that we're learning about here, the domed roofed structure, the Bayit Gadol, the large structure, large chamber, is called Beit HaMoked, whereas the place of the fire is called the Lishkat Beit HaMoked, if you would, the chamber of the fire, or the place of the fire, which is in itself a place within the larger structure of the Beit HaMoked. Now, what exactly is the proximity and the situation regarding the relationship between the Beit HaMoked and this mikveh and the function of these chambers? We're going to be learning as we continue in this halacha and in the next. In the meantime, let's explain the concept of the ptachim, the entrances, which the Rambam mentions here at the end of halacha tet again. Ushnei ptachim hayulo. There were 2 entrances, one open to the azara and the other opened to the chel. And here again, this is mentioned in the Mishnah. These ptachim, as in the language of the Rambam, these openings are called sha'arim in the language of the Mishnah, where it's depicted that the northern shar is open to the chel, and the southern gate, again shar meaning gate, open to the azara. And this is the structure of this chamber. Continuing in halacha yud, the Rambam tells us about arba leshachot hayu bo. So now we're talking about the overall structure of this large chamber, the domed structure, the Beit HaMoked. He tells us there were 4 chambers within it. Shtayim kodesh ushtayim chol. 2 of these chambers had the status of being sanctified area within the temple, and 2 of them had the status of being considered to be mundane, to be non-holy. V'rashei pispasin mavdilin ben hakodesh v'hachol. And there were dividing lines. There was a system, a sort of line of demarcation, we'll see exactly what this was constructed of that divided between the holy area and the non-holy area. We have to see exactly what he means by this. Let's just continue in the meantime. Umeh hayu mishamshot, and these 4 chambers located within the larger structure of the Beit HaMoked, what was their purpose? It tells us, Maravit Dromit, the one in the southwest corner of the Beit HaMoked, is called the Lishkat Hatzlaim, the chamber of the lambs. Udromit Mizrachit, and on the southeastern corner, Lishkat Osei Lechem Hapanim. This is the chamber of the makers of the showbread. Mizrachit Tzfonit, and the northeast corner, Ba Ganzu Beit Chashmonai Avnei Mizbeach Sheshiktsum Malchei Yavan. There, the kings, the victors of the house of the Chashmonai, the Kohanim, who were the descendants of the Chashmonaim who liberated, purified the temple from the Greek invaders, there in that northeast chamber, the Chashmonaim stored, they actually ganzu, they hid away, they secreted away the stones that had been desecrated, the altar stones that had been desecrated by the Greek kings when the Greeks offered up impure offerings to their pagan gods, their idolatrous gods, on the altar of the temple of Hashem. They rendered those stones unfit. The stones were uprooted by the Maccabees, the Chashmonaim, when they took over the temple again. But because the stones had originally been sanctified, they couldn't just be discarded, so they were stored in this chamber. Thus far is what we know. We'll see what we can understand further. Tzfonit Maravit Ba Yordin Lebeit HaTfilah. And then in the northwest corner, he says, through that chamber, you would go down to the chamber of immersion. In other words, to the place where the mikveh was located, apparently underneath the Beit HaMoked. So we have to understand what is this process. One would go to this special area and go down, Ba Yordin, there they would descend to the chamber of immersion underneath the Beit HaMoked. So let's go a little further now and understand what we are dealing with here. First of all, the Rambam tells us, again, there are 4 chambers within the chamber of the Beit HaMoked, 2 in the holy area, 2 in the non-holy area, a line of demarcation between them. And the Mishnah, back in Tractate Midot again, expresses it as follows, that there are these 4 chambers within the Beit HaMoked, which open up into a large hall like small bedrooms. In other words, the description the Mishnah is using, they're called kikitonot, like smaller bed chambers that open up onto a larger central room. And this concept of 2 in the holy sanctified area, 2 in the chol, the non-sacred area, with dividing line of demarcation between them. The 2 chambers that were in the north were situated in the chel, and the 2 in the south were situated in the azara. Now, this concept of the Rashi Pispasin, these protrusions that would separate between the holy and the non-holy, the Rambam explains in his commentary on the Mishnah, is like a small mechitza, like a small fence. And there are different interpretations he mentions of what this fence, or such a fence, is constructed of, whether a lattice work or whether something made of reeds, made of wood, or made of stone. And the Bartanura, important commentary on the Mishnah, calls them Rashi Korot HaYotzim Min HaKotza, like the tops of beams that were protruding from the wall, some sort of siman, of sign, a reminder, to serve as a line of demarcation. The Rambam tells us again, sometimes they are made of other construction materials. Basic understanding that we have is that these were like small stone markers, as we have illustrated it, that protrude from the floor to remind the Kohanim that past this area begins the holy area. We're going to be talking more about that. Let's just mention again, on the southwest corner, the Lishkat Hatzlaim, in this chamber, which is actually situated in the Kodesh, the sanctified area, there were stored the lambs that had been designated as the candidates for the daily offering. Mishnah actually teaches us in Tractate Erchin that at all times there is a minimum of 6 lambs that have already been checked that are kept in that chamber, so that in the temple they need not at the last minute have to locate the lambs for the daily offering. The lambs were checked and ascertained to be free from blemishes 4 days before that particular designated lamb was to be offered. They're kept here in this chamber. We're going to be continuing, going further and further into the concepts of these chambers within the Beit HaMoked, in the women's court, as we continue learning about the Holy Temple, place of the Divine Presence, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.
Dedications are available for upcoming Light to the Nations teachings. To make a dedication, simply click on the dedication link below the video. Dedications can be made either by check or by credit card via our online form. Add your personal dedication and pick your preferred date. Your dedication will appear as you have designated. In addition, you will receive a personal DVD copy of the show. Your dedications make these productions possible.